Thank you very much, Steve. I've never seen you choke up before. This is obviously an occasion for a lot of good emotions, and I know that you're connecting with one another after sometimes months and years of absence, so I hope you engage in your suitable number of conspiracies and plans. I've already cooked something up with Tom Sussman of the American Bar Association. He doesn't quite know that yet. The occasion here taught me something, is that we really don't toot our horn enough. I think Public Citizen probably is at the bottom of the heap in terms of tooting its horn. It's just not our personality. That's not to say there aren't strong egos in Public Citizen. The project directors, boy, they're really tough. They do a terrific job. And you can always tell a Public Citizen project director, but you can't tell them much. But collectively, we really haven't. I just saw this like you all did, and it's really quite impressive. And it's only scratching the surface. A celebration, is a good time to look backward as well as forward. I'm just going to make a few thoughts on this. But first of all, I do want to recognize somebody here in the audience who year in and year out has been the great connector, great networker, great advisor to scores of groups, hundreds of people, year after year. And he's perfected the selfless art of radical modesty. I'm referring to John Richard. By the way, if you ever want to refer to him by his real name, he's Giovanni Riccardo El Magnifico. There's also someone else here I just want to briefly recognize because the absence of people like him severely undermined the effectiveness of citizen groups, even though he maintained a very strict sense of distance and newsworthiness. The absence of people like him today in the media has been an enormous loss, and I want to recognize Morton Mintz of the Washington Post. The Occupy Wall Street presence, it's not yet a movement, it's a presence. That's very important. Showing up is half of democracy, and staying gets you to third base, maybe. It does something to all the rest of us and others who are self-cloistered. Although they have a sense of justice, they haven't made the next move, whether it's in business, in labor, in religious groups, in neighborhood groups. I realized that in the late 60s when I was focusing on environmental consumer issues and the rest of the activists were against the Vietnam War, on the barricades in the civil rights movement. And I said to myself, how am I getting this done? How am I finding such good people? And the answer was, the people are in the streets, especially young people, creates a complete different aura of possibility, a complete different energy to people who haven't yet crossed the threshold into the arena known as taking your conscience to work, into the arena of seeing justice as a great work of human beings on earth. There are people who may see themselves on the edge of the establishment. They just didn't have the push to go into their arenas. So what we're going to see from this Occupy initiative, we're going to see more people who have nothing to do with this effort begin to speak out. The lawyers in towns around America who say, we know what the courts are like. We know what access to justice is in reality. They come forward. And the doctors begin coming forward. This aura of possibility created by less than 130,000 young people, mostly, who have gone out into the streets and encamped and marched. illustrates what a huge pool that we have to tap in this country. There are 24 million people looking for work who can't find work, for example. There are all kinds of people who are saying, quo vadis, where do we go? How do we get there? And always it's the people who hit the streets. That's been the history. The people who hit the streets first that encourage and provide the courage to people who will come after them. So it's that huge penumbra that can come into play as it did in the 60s and 70s. Some people wonder why Richard Nixon signed into law with flourishing descriptions the EPA legislation, the OSHA legislation, the Consumer Product Safety legislation. How he put to Congress a health insurance plan better than Clinton's, which they didn't pass. How he supported voting rights for people in the District of Columbia, and the Congress didn't respond to that. How he had a drug proposal that emphasized rehabilitation instead of incarceration. How he had a minimum incomes plan as the first step to abolish poverty. I don't think he believed really in most of this. Why did he do this? Because he still heard the echoes of the rumbles from the people, from the 60s, spilling over into the early 70s. The rumble from the people. He was the last Republican president to fear liberals, unfortunately. Going back to the early days of Public Citizen, some people here might wonder where the name came from. Well, my brother Shaft, my sister Claire, and I were sitting in a cafeteria on Connecticut Avenue. Shoals? Some of you. That's where you got a side dish of vegetables for a nickel if you could pick it up without it slipping out of your hands. But it had a great spirit to it. And we came up with Public Citizen, which comes from the ancient Athenian period of democracy where public citizens went around the city of Athens trying to improve it, fulfilling their Athenian pledge of citizenship, which was, to paraphrase more simply, to leave Athens better off than one entered it. And so I thought that was a great title, and it certainly has fulfilled its spirit. Well, then the question was, my brother Shaft would always say, if you don't get buildings, you're not going to be seen as permanent in this city. And I said, well, try and find us a building on Capitol Hill, because we're going to have a Congress lobby. Congress lobby is there, and it would be good to have a building. So he came back one day, he said, I've spotted a building. It's on Pennsylvania Avenue, 215. It's a big building, and it needs some modification and some remodeling. But I found that it has excellent wiring and a massive vault. And I said, Shaft, who occupied this before us? Terrific wiring and a massive vault. He said, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So that's what Congress Watch is in now. Looking back, really it's about taking your conscience to work. To the extent that I have a philosophy of de-management, it's to find good people and give them a lot of autonomy, and they then become very responsible for themselves. They don't come to work trying to blame someone else, and become responsible for themselves, and they grow much faster. They become bolder. They become more creative. And in that sense, I wish more citizen groups did that. There are citizen groups, which we won't mention, where every press release is centralized. The people who did the work are often named. It's sort of a kind of branding to try to get one person visible. I never bought that. The idea was to try to make more people nationally known. More people nationally known, as Sid Wolfe and Joan Claybrook and Alan Morrison and Mark Green in the old days, and many more since. Unfortunately, the press makes it very difficult to make people nationally known on their own merits, but that was the attempt. And it just occurred early this morning, how do we describe what we achieved? And I said, well, why not monetize it? I mean, we're fighting monetized mines every day in Washington. So why don't we monetize it? Because what we do is we give the victories and we say, well, it stands on its own. Cars have been recalled, pharmaceuticals have been recalled, regulatory deterioration has been slowed down, etc. But let's look at it from a monetary point of view. Let's look at it from a cost-benefit point of view. I estimate that Public Citizen has spent in 40 years, minus all the money spent to raise money, deduct that, about $200 million in 40 years. That is about the cost of one F-22 fighter before the latest cost overruns. A fighter, by the way, that could fit on this 3 times the size of this stage. Now just think in terms of the benefit. Think of and Public Citizen has always been more of a sine qua non group. That is, if it wasn't for Public Citizen, it would not have happened. It isn't just a matter of piling on. All citizen groups pile on. All citizen groups try to take a little bit more credit for doing this and that. A Public Citizen, because of the pioneering nature, is a sine qua non group. And just think of the benefits. Think of the billions of dollars that the tax reform group blocked in the latter days of a congressional session, the so-called Christmas tree bills. Think of the lives saved by the health research group and Sidney Wolf in terms of getting 600 drugs in a period of a decade off the market with highly publicized books on the Phil Donahue show, etc. Drugs that don't work, pills that don't work, over-the-counter pills that don't work, or prescription drugs that don't work. They were costing people billions of dollars a year. They were not effective, and they had side effects that were not very pleasant. Most of them are completely gone at the present time. Think of the litigation that Allen and his colleagues have pursued. In one case, the veto, the line item veto case, in one case, more statutes were held unconstitutional than all statutes to date from the first decision of the Supreme Court. And he restored the power of the Congress, which was willing or willing to give the president the right to pick and choose what he's going to veto in a bill that was put on his or her desk. Think of the freedom of information cases. Information is the currency of democracy. And think of the universality of that access. One thing that marks Public Citizen is almost everything they do is universally utilizable. In other words, it isn't just a certain segment of the population. The Freedom of Information Act is so universally utilizable, and we had a big role in the 1974 amendments, that the businesses are using it probably more than anybody now to get information about one another from the Food and Drug Administration or EPA. Think of the work that Joan Claybrook and her assistants have done keeping the heat on NHTSA and on the auto companies, and the recalls, and the lives saved, and the amendments strengthening the NHTSA bill. Think of the heroic effort that Public Citizen engaged in blocking what could have been a terminating attack on the regulatory apparatus in the health and safety area, which was under severe attack called regulatory reform. Think of the work that's being done now to keep the doors open to wrongfully wounded people by wrongdoers under our tort law system, which is being unfortunately shredded faster than we can stop it from being so. And the work of offshoot groups that came out of Public Citizen, out of the center, like the Center for Justice and Democracy, Joy Dorshow, who's here tonight. Think of the OSHA regulations. Think of the billions of dollars that went to Appalachian widows and children because some of the 400,000 miners who gave their lives for their coal companies since 1890, more than the number of people killed in World War II, U.S. people killed in World War II, got billions of dollars in payments for coal miners' pneumoconiosis. otherwise known as black lung disease, and the standards that reduce the exposure of miners to that deadly coal dust. Think of what would have happened to what's left of our economic sovereignty, what's left of our anti-redlining laws, if Laurie Wallach and her people, in collaboration with some Canadians, did not spot the emergence of the multilateral investment proposal, which was the analog to the World Trade Organization. That would have completed the economic stranglehold of an autocratic system of transnational governance that sidesteps our courts and our regulatory agencies. Think of all that. And I haven't begun to scratch the surface. And what you heard tonight hasn't begun to scratch the surface. And it's $200 million. You would think in a rational society, someone would have looked at that who's a multi-billionaire and said, that's a pretty good investment. Let's double it. Let's triple it. Let's quadruple it. Let's quintuple it. There are far more people wanting to do this work who are capable and dedicated and have the perseverance and the stamina than there are opportunities. They're hard to find, to be sure, but they are there. But the opportunities aren't there. So we really have to ask ourselves, what happens when we fail? As you know, we don't win all these battles. Are we right even though we fail? And you might want to chronicle how many times we were right even though we failed, and we were proven right again and again and again. It isn't because we're so superior. It's because when you take your conscience to work, when you have your priorities in order, when you're incorruptible, when you stick with the facts, when you have a public philosophy wrapped around them, you're more likely to be accurate than Bush, Cheney, Obama, and all the rest of them, who have other compromising restrictions on their minds and their sense of clarity. There is something that afflicts us all. It's being overloaded with information. There's so much information now that people try to keep up with it, and they never can. And instead of having time to take an information piece and turn it into knowledge, and then turn it into judgment, and then turn it into wisdom, we're still overwhelmed with this daily influx of information. Which makes me a rare resort, to a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay. Very short poem. This was in the 1930s, before the internet, before the huge rush of information. Here's the poem. Upon this gifted age, in its dark hour, meaning a depression, rains from the sky a meteoric shower of facts. They lie unquestioned, uncombined, wisdom enough to leach us of our ill is daily spun, but there exists no loom to weave it into fabric. Very, very well put, I thought. Let's look forward briefly. What are the problems of success? The enemy of greater success is contemporary success, because it can lead to excessive self-confidence, it can lead to plateauing, it could lead to a non-enlargement of one's civic ambitions, it can lead to a lot of things that start producing redundant years, start producing insufficient challenge to pinch us and push us and to stretch us. Civic activity stretches our best nature, just as democracy gets the best out of people. So I have just a few quick points as to how to engage in what John Gardner once said in his wonderful book, Self-Renewal. He also wrote a wonderful book called On Leadership, which I would recommend that the younger generation here in Public Citizen read, if I can ever get them to read one book. Here's the first. Liberal progressives in this town do not spend enough time across organizations. They may sign on to coalitions and sometimes have a strategy meeting on global warming, but they really don't aggregate themselves as they could and as they should. And a lot of it is they're so busy, they don't even have time to return calls. They're so busy, they don't have time to return calls. We've got to confront that problem because it's devouring a lot of our potential. Number two, we have to leave slack time. If we don't have slack time, we're not going to be able to jump on when there's a sudden assault on freedom, liberty, justice, when there's a sudden move by our adversaries to erode the fabric of our tender democratic society. I remember that was when Nixon fired Archibald Cox, the Watergate prosecutor, and then Attorney General quit, Richardson, and he put Robert Bork as acting. I called Alan Morrison up. I went down with Harrison Welper. Actually, it was pouring rain. We had a kind of vigil guard around the Watergate prosecutor's office. And I called Alan, and I said, Alan, we've got to do something about this. And we met on Sunday afternoon with quite a few people in Public Citizen to plan the litigation strategy and to plan the education strategy, too, for the reporters. Now, Alan could have said what he has said on some occasions, I don't have time. Had he said, I don't have time, because his cup is full, he's got plenty of cases, that would not have happened. If we don't leave enough slack time, we will never go on the offensive as we should. Once we're placed on the defensive, in terms of the huge corporate juggernaut that came in, starting in the mid-'70s, more trade lobbies, more campaign cash, more law firms, more media, Chamber of Commerce type media, etc. When that came at us, it's very hard to avoid being on the defensive. Once you're on the defensive, it's very difficult to go on offense. That's why you have to have slack time. There has to be a section of the organization that does nothing but do offensive action. Thirdly, I hope the younger generation will aspire to be more effective than their precursors. If they don't do that, then the dynamic will start filtering downward. They've got to feel they can stand on the shoulders of people like Alan Morrison, Joan Claybrook, and Sid Wolfe, and Mark Green, and Bob Falmouth, who chaired Public Citizen for so many years, and others, and actually be better than they in terms of their effectiveness and all the other qualities that might be called the civic personality, which of course is not just cognitive knowledge. It's a certain intangible combination of refusing to be discouraged, of being resilient, of sharing credit, of always renewing yourself and reading, and being self-motivated. Fourth, we need to multiply more groups. I have a whole agenda on how we can create more groups, and I'm looking for people to help. We can start groups out of Cypre awards. We can start groups out of citizen utility boards or Cubs in a whole variety of areas, checkoffs in billing envelopes by banks and insurance companies. We can do a whole raft of things which are not agenda immediate Congress the core, but to build more and more oak trees in the deforested area of our deteriorating democracy. Fifth, we need to have a residential thinker full-time. There needs to be someone who does not go to work on the ramparts every day, but broadens the imagination and the frame of reference and the information that would not accrue to people who are trying to put out fires every day in the battles that occur. We need that very, very badly. Otherwise, we'll get into very specialized cul-de-sacs, and you know what I mean. We can be extremely sharp by becoming incredibly narrow. Six, we got to think really big. There are billionaires and multi-billionaires who are signing up with Buffett and Gates to pledge half of their wealth to good works. And when I talked to Buffett about this, he put quotes around good works. He said, we have to now figure out how to do good works. And I said, well, one way is to try to move from charity to justice. Soup kitchens are charity. Prevention of hunger is justice. Prevention of poverty is justice. And I know a lot of people in our line of work don't like to spend time with multi-billionaires. But let me tell you, you might be quite accurate in stereotyping 99% of them as narcissistic and self-regarding. But all you need is 1%, and there are plenty of billionaires, multi-billionaires. All you need is 1%, especially in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, who have a different perspective on life and want to look at their grandchild in the eye and have an enlightened background. Now, I did try to put this thought in 720 pages of a book of political fiction called Only the Super Rich Can Save Us, and it's in quotes. And I plead with some of you to read it because you'll get some ideas on how to think really big. And I'll give you an example. Warren Buffett told me that one of the things he'd really like to do is a top-down reform of the tax system. Okay? All right? Now, suppose we put on, Warren Buffett, by the way, pledged to give $32 billion to the Gates Foundation in installments. Okay, now suppose we put a proposal on his desk and we say, here's the proposal to get through Congress, 535 men and women put their shoes on every day like you and I, and major tax reform. And I mean not just rates, but taxing things we like the least or dislike the most, like speculation taxes and carbon taxes before we tax work. And it's going to cost $1 billion. And we're going to organize in every congressional district, and we're going to have full-time people, okay? Well, what would he say to that? He's a businessman. He knows what his prospectus is. We have to think on those levels, because now $1 billion is almost a chip shot for some of these people. He gave $32 billion to the Gates Foundation. So we have to think bigger. Let me hear it from the young. Think big. Okay. Finally, let us not excise from our field of concern old battles lost, never renewed. Nobody talks now, even in labor circles, about repealing the notorious anti-labor law called the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 and many other similars. We have to expand from a few lovely oak trees in a plundered forest because, and this is a rather dismal note, the forces of corporatist disintegration are rapidly outrunning the forces of civic integration. And that is the prescription for a doomed society if we don't reverse it. And for the people I didn't mention by name, please forgive me. And for an extension of many years of wisdom from the state of Texas, I will defer to Bill Moyers. Thank you.